Picture this. It's November 1918, and engineers across Europe are staring at a problem that just won't quit. The Great War has ended, but the lesson is carved into every muddy battlefield from Verdun to the Somme. Wheels alone can't win wars anymore. Trucks get stuck, tanks break down, and somehow armies need to move men and guns across terrain that looks like the surface of the moon. That's where our story begins. In the strange space between two ideas that shouldn't work together but somehow must. The half-track concept didn't just appear out of thin air. Back in 1915, a French engineer named Adolphe Caigres was working for Tsar Nicholas II in Russia, trying to keep the royal family's cars moving through Siberian snow. Caigres did something no one had done before. He replaced the back wheels of a car with a flexible tracked suspension while keeping the steering wheels up front. It wasn't a tank, but it also wasn't a truck. It was something new, a machine that could glide across mud, ice, and snow while still steering like a normal vehicle. The Tsar loved it. The military noticed it. But then the Russian Revolution erased the project overnight, and Caigres fled back to France with his strange invention that no one yet realized would change warfare forever. Fast forward 2 decades. World War II is days away from exploding across Europe, and armies are rediscovering the exact same problem. Tanks were expensive, trucks were fragile, mobility meant survival. And suddenly, engineers around the world turned back to the long-forgotten idea of a vehicle that was neither one nor the other. A machine born out of necessity in a failed monarchy, now waiting for its moment. The half-track wasn't built to be legendary. It was built because war made good enough useless, and improvisation became destiny. The idea looked clever on paper, but the real urgency didn't hit until armies began trying to fight modern wars with old mobility. In 1939 and 1940, everyone still believed the tank was the future, the spearhead of the new mechanized battlefield. But even tanks had a fatal weakness. They could punch through an enemy line, but the infantry couldn't keep up. Trucks bogged down as soon as the terrain stopped cooperating. Horses and foot soldiers were even slower, and when a breakthrough stalled, the tank became a lonely, exposed target. Firepower without follow-through was useless. The Americans saw it firsthand in the North African desert. The French suffered it in 1940. The Germans, despite their reputation, quietly admitted it too. Mobility was now a system problem, not a vehicle problem. Armies needed a fast, reliable way to move men, guns, ammo, and support equipment over terrain a wheeled vehicle couldn't handle, but where a tank was simply overkill. And that's when the half-track went from interesting concept to urgent solution. The US didn't start with some elegant blueprint. They started with a panic. A realization that they didn't have enough armored transports to keep pace with the war they were about to fight. So rather than designing a new platform from scratch, American engineers began scavenging from what already existed. They took the front steering system of a truck, married it to a light tank's tracked suspension, and suddenly they had something that could go almost anywhere and didn't cost a fortune to build. But at this point, and this is crucial, the half-track was still officially labeled as a troop transport, nothing more. It wasn't armored enough to be considered a fighting vehicle. It wasn't armed enough to threaten tanks, and no doctrine existed for using it as anything other than a motorized taxi for infantry squads. The official thinking was, deliver soldiers, then get out of the way. That mindset would not survive contact with reality for very long, because once these vehicles arrived in North Africa in late 1942, American infantry immediately found themselves in a deadly paradox. They could reach the fight, but they couldn't stay in it. Half-tracks were fast enough to keep up with tanks, but too lightly armed to support them. Soldiers could drive into a position, but not hold it. And when artillery or machine gun fire opened up, they had mobility but no punch. That gap between doctrine and reality is where innovation begins. Out on the front line, miles away from staff officers and Pentagon paperwork, mechanics and gunners started to reinterpret what the half-track really was. They looked at the armor plating and thought, why not add more? They looked at the open top and thought, why not mount a heavier gun? They looked at the chassis and thought, this is steadier than a Jeep, so why not fire from it? This wasn't engineering from a blueprint. This was pressure-forged necessity. The crews weren't asking, what is the half-track supposed to be? They were asking, what can we get away with making it do? Soon, field laboratories began popping up along the Tunisian front, not with white coats and chalkboards, but with cutting torches, scrap steel, and welders' sparks at midnight. A vehicle born to move troops was about to become something far deadlier. And once command saw what soldiers were building on their own, they didn't shut it down. They took notes. Because what was happening in the desert wasn't improvisation anymore. It was evolution. The first breakthroughs didn't come from design bureaus or factories. They came from dusty forward repair depots where sleepless mechanics worked under canvas tarps with enemy artillery rumbling in the distance. These weren't men developing doctrine. They were surviving it, and nothing changes doctrine faster than not wanting to die. The earliest modification was crude but revealing. Sandbags, stacked across the floorboards, piled along the sides, wedged behind gun shields. Anything to stop a burst of 7.92mm Mauser fire from slicing through the thin hull. Then came salvaged armor plates ripped off disabled enemy vehicles and bolted to the gunners' positions. Engineers back home imagined half-tracks as taxis. Soldiers in Tunisia had just reimagined them as gun wagons. The next improvised leap was firepower. Infantrymen began mounting spare 30 and 50 cal Brownings onto ring mounts welded to the rear decking. Not a single manual told them this was authorized, but men under fire don't pause to ask permission. American mechanics discovered something no theorist had predicted. The half-track was stable enough to fire while moving. The recoil didn't spin the vehicle or bog it down. Suddenly, infantry could lay down suppressive fire at full speed, something neither a tank nor a truck was built to do. One officer later wrote, "It didn't take long before every gunner wanted his half-track to look less like a transport and more like a porcupine." By early 1943, some frontline half-tracks looked like mobile fortresses, jury-rigged, ugly, and terrifyingly practical. Then came what historians now call the Tunisian moment, the event that permanently changed the way half-tracks were understood. During a German counterattack near Kasserine, a U.S. infantry unit found itself under pressure from enemy machine gun nests positioned along a ridge. A formation of half-tracks didn't wait for tanks or artillery. Instead, they charged forward, machine guns roaring, firing on the move, delivering troops directly onto the ridge with live suppressive fire. It worked. The German position collapsed. After action. Reports didn't call them troop transports. They called them mobile assault platforms. And that single phrase changed everything. Instead of waiting for doctrinal permission, the battlefield had forced a reclassification. The half-track was no longer just a way to deliver infantry to a fight. It was a way to deliver the fight with the infantry still inside it. High command couldn't ignore the proof. These improvised vehicles were winning engagements they had no business winning. Better yet, they did it cheaply, quickly, and without redesigning supply chains or manufacturing lines. The front had spoken, and the Pentagon listened. Within months, engineers in the States weren't just reinforcing what the troops were already doing. They were studying how to make it official. Mounting brackets became standardized. Armor plating was factory issued. Ammunition storage changed. Tactical manuals were rewritten. The half-track wasn't a compromise anymore. It was the first modular combat vehicle of the modern battlefield. A platform that could become anything depending on what you bolted onto it. What began as field improvisation was about to become doctrine. And doctrine was about to become a revolution. Because the next step wasn't just bigger guns or more armor. It was something far more radical. If a half-track could carry infantry and machine guns, why not make it carry artillery? In other words, why wait for fire support when the fire support could ride with you? That question would break the dam wide open in the next stage of its evolution. What happened next wasn't a small adjustment. It was a doctrinal earthquake. Engineers stopped thinking of the half-track as a transport and started treating it like a weapons chassis. Instead of asking, what can this vehicle carry? They began asking, what can this vehicle become? The first big leap was the 37mm cannon. Originally designed as an anti-tank gun for infantry crews, it had already started falling behind in firepower by 1943. On foot, it was too light to stop newer German armor. But on a fast mobile platform, it suddenly became a hit-and-run weapon. Mounted to a half-track, it could dash forward, fire, and relocate before enemy gunners could return fire. It was no longer a static support gun. It had become maneuverable. When that worked, the engineers pushed further. The 57mm gun was next. This wasn't improvisation anymore. This was experimentation with a purpose. They were no longer attaching guns to half-tracks. They were turning half-tracks into guns. The moment generals saw how quickly these conversions could be made, the U.S. Army realized something monumental. They had stumbled into a universal platform, instead of building separate vehicles for infantry, artillery, anti-tank roles, and logistics. They could build one chassis, then give it whatever battlefield identity the situation required. It was wartime modularity before anyone had a word for it. The M3 half-track became the base template, and from it emerged a growing family of battlefield variants. Some carried infantry, some carried mortars, some carried direct-fire cannons, Some became mobile gun carriages, and none of this required a brand new production line. The same factory stamping the hull for one version could convert it into 5 different combat roles if needed. This was logistics turned into strategy. But doctrine wasn't the only thing evolving. Confidence was evolving too. Crews began driving these new gun half-tracks into places tanks couldn't go. Narrow farm lanes, forest edges, rocky slopes, marshy passes. The combination of truck steering and tracked traction gave them a kind of battlefield agility nobody had planned for. They could pivot like a truck and push like a tank. And the Germans felt the difference. In Tunisia, half-track gun crews began outrunning German infantry. In Sicily, U.S. units used them to fire on the move across winding mountain roads where even Shermans hesitated. In Italy, they became artillery in motion, a terrifying idea for defenders expecting static fire missions. The battlefield had just acquired something Germany didn't anticipate: firepower with speed. The psychological effect was real. German troops were trained to look for threats coming slowly. Tanks grinding forward, artillery firing from predictable distance. But half-track gun carriages shattered that rhythm. Fire could erupt from a hedgerow, a farm path, a tree line, then vanish before counterfire could lock on. And it all came from a design that wasn't supposed to be a weapon at all. By mid-1943, the U.S. had stopped thinking of half-tracks as vehicles and started thinking of them as force multipliers on wheels and tracks, the Swiss Army knife of mechanized warfare. The final transformation was now only a step away, because once artillery found its way onto a half-track, the next question practically asked itself: if a half-track could bring guns forward, why couldn't it bring the sky down with it too? The birth of the mobile artillery. Roll what began as jury-rigged machine gun mounts and sandbag skirts matured, almost overnight, into a radically new kind of battlefield asset: mobile artillery. The same half-track that had once merely carried squads now carried the means to demolish a defensive position, ambush armor, or lay down direct fire support the instant infantry needed it. The change was as much tactical as technical. No longer did artillery arrive after the fight. Now the guns rode in the fight. Engineers and ordnance officers in North Africa quickly learned a basic truth: firepower is only useful if it can get to where enemies hide. Towed guns were slow, vulnerable, and required time and space to emplace. Pack guns were portable but lacked reach. Mount a medium-caliber gun on a half-track? Suddenly you had a weapon that could drive into position, unlimber for an instant, and punch with the kind of direct fire previously reserved for tanks and fixed batteries. The first successful experiments featured 37mm and 57mm anti-tank pieces bolted into reinforced rear beds. Those weapons already existed in infantry arsenals. What changed was mobility. A half-track could sprint along rough tracks, crest a ridge, and fire point blank at an enemy anti-tank position before the enemy could counter-battery. The psychological effect was immense. Defenders who believed they were safe behind a ridge found metal screaming through their foxholes half an hour after they thought the danger had passed. Encouraged, ordnance teams pushed bolder conversions. The 75mm gun, the workhorse field piece, found its way into larger gun carriages and, in modified form, onto robust half-track frames. These gun motor carriages allowed units to bring true artillery forward on the heels of an assault. Rather than massing batteries miles back and calling for scheduled barrages, assault commanders could direct a half-track battery to roll up, deliver short-pointed plunging fire or direct HE rounds, then displace before enemy counterfire corrected. Tactically, this rewrote close support doctrine. Infantry no longer had to bite down and hold a position until divisional artillery arrived. They could call for an on-scene half-track gun that would lay smoke, hammer a hedge line, or blast a concrete pillbox in minutes. The effect on tempo was dramatic. Advances that once required long pauses for artillery registration now kept moving. That momentum multiplied operationally. Units exploited gaps faster, compressed enemy reaction windows, and reduced casualties from prolonged exposure. Logistics adapted too. A half-track-borne gun needed ammunition, and the Army's motor pools devised short resupply trains of half-track carriers. Instead of one cumbersome artillery column, commanders had modular resupply elements that kept forward gun platoons fed on the move. Crews trained to fire, limber up, and relocate within minutes. Drills emphasized speed and precision as much as accuracy. Field commanders saw battlefield niches open up. In bocage and mountain terrain where tanks hesitated, mobile 57mm and 75mm half-tracks clipped flanks and neutralized anti-tank positions. In urban edges, they could deliver plunging fire down narrow streets where conventional artillery could not aim without collateral risk. In open deserts, they became rapid response anti-armor teams, darting to threatened sectors to blunt panzers before heavier forces could arrive. The Germans initially dismissed these conversions as expedient but unsustainable. But as reports accumulated, position after position taken, armored sallies bled, and counterattacks repelled by guns that seemed to appear out of nowhere, Reich commanders had to revise their assumptions. They began redeploying forces to guard likely flanking avenues and increasing reconnaissance to spot mobile gun emplacements. That reallocation of resources often played into Allied hands. Cover was stripped from other sectors, and momentum widened into advantage. By mid-1943, what had been ad hoc was being standardized. Mounting brackets, magazine stowage, recoil buffers, and armored shields were refined. Training curricula taught half-track artillery crews direct fire tables, rapid limber procedures, and combined arms signaling with infantry and tanks. In the span of a few campaigns, the half-track became less a compromise and more a doctrine. Artillery that moved when the battle moved. The birth of mobile artillery changed battles from attritional slugfests into choreographed advances. Fast, flexible, and lethal. Next came another leap. If half-tracks could carry guns to the front, could they also bring air defense and do both? The answer would come soon, and with it, the fearsome sight of quad 50s sweeping skies and ground alike. The half-track becomes a guardian of the skies by 1943. The battlefield was no longer two-dimensional. Ground forces didn't just fight tanks and infantry, they fought threats raining down from above. Stuka dives in North Africa, FD-190 strikes in Sicily. And low strafing runs in Italy taught Allied commanders a brutal lesson. If you can't shield your advance from the air, you lose momentum, men, and machines. The standard response, towing an anti-aircraft gun behind a truck, was only partially effective. It worked from fixed positions, but not on the march. Supply convoys and forward spearheads needed something that moved with them. The solution was waiting in plain sight, the half-track. The transition from troop carrier to mobile air defense platform happened astonishingly fast. Engineers realized that the same stability and low center of gravity that made half-tracks excellent gun motor carriages also made them steady firing bases for rapid traverse mounts. Instead of bolting down a field cannon, they equipped the chassis with ring mounts, swivel pedestals, and eventually remote rotation turrets. What rolled out of the workshops was a battlefield hybrid, part transport, part fighting fortress, and crucially, a moving umbrella of firepower. The early versions carried single 50 caliber heavy machine guns. These proved effective against low, slow strafers or recon aircraft making bold passes. But air threats were getting faster, thicker-skinned, and more aggressive. So the armament escalated. First twin mounts, then quads. The now iconic Quad 50, 450 caliber M2 Brownings, grouped into one screaming package of lead, gave even seasoned Luftwaffe pilots second thoughts about closing in on a target column. With the quad, doctrine changed. Half-tracks didn't just react to enemy planes, they warned them off. A pilot banking for a strafing run would suddenly see a flickering wall of tracers boiling upward, searching for wings, radiator lines, and control surfaces. The volume of fire was so intense that even when it didn't kill, it forced a break-off. In air war terms, forced disengagement is as valuable as a confirmed kill. The skies were contested again, not just at airfield perimeters, but above every advancing armored spearhead. More importantly, a new kind of synergy emerged between these AA half-tracks and the frontline units they shadowed. Infantry columns marching through exposed valleys could keep moving instead of hugging ditches. Tank crews no longer felt naked the moment they outran rear-area air cover. Supply caravans didn't have to wait for a clear sky before advancing fuel and ammunition. Momentum survived, and momentum wins wars. But like most battlefield innovations, the engineers quickly found a second use for their creation. The Quad 50 wasn't just deadly to aircraft. Against infantry, trucks, and soft-skinned vehicles, it was savage. A burst from one of those mounts swept trenches, shredded light cover, and cleared roadblocks faster than grenades or rifles ever could. In close support roles, AA half-tracks became urban street-clearing monsters. They could rake windows, balconies, and bunker slits without risking tank ammunition or exposing rifle squads. Some commanders even began attaching AA half-tracks as reserve surge fire teams. When an assault bogged down, a single quad mount could be driven to the bottleneck and unleash a sheet of fire that melted resistance long enough for infantry to break through. This dual-purpose role blurred the line between support vehicle and assault vehicle. The psychological effect was as potent as the tactical one. German pilots who once hunted columns now approached with caution. German infantry who once prepared stiff ambushes now hesitated, knowing that a half-track hiding behind a hedgerow could turn the lane into a scythe of tracer fire. In doctrine manuals, this was still air defense. In practice, it was air denial and ground dominance wrapped into a single mobile chassis. By the time Italy gave way to France, the half-track was no longer a humble transport. It was evolving into a modular weapons platform. Change the mount, change the mission. The next frontier would push this logic to its limit. Could you combine fire support, air defense, troop transport, and armor into one integrated battlefield vehicle? Wartime necessity was about to say yes, and in doing so, point the way to what would eventually become the modern infantry fighting vehicle. When one chassis replaced 3 vehicles by mid-1943, the battlefield had stopped tolerating specialization that slowed armies down. Commanders wanted effect, not classifications. They needed weapons that moved with formations, not behind them. The half-track quietly answered that demand by doing something radical. It collapsed roles. Where once a commander needed a truck to move men, a towed gun to hit targets, and a small anti-aircraft truck to ward off flyers, a handful of half-track variants could replace them all, and in doing so simplified logistics, sped operations, and changed how battles were fought. The transformation was partly technical and partly doctrinal. Technically, the M3 chassis proved an exceptionally flexible base. Roomy enough to carry a squad with ammunition, sturdy enough to accept a recoil-buffered gun mount, and stable enough to operate fast traverse AA pedestals. Oriented by need, ordnance shops produced standardized mounting kits, armor plates here, a pinel mount there, a reinforced bed panel for a gun cradle, that turned a troop carrier into a fire support truck in a matter of hours. Doctrinally, commanders stopped thinking in vehicle types and began thinking in capabilities on wheels: move, protect, and hit. The operational payoff was immediate. A regimental commander could now task a single company with multiple missions. Escort the battalion's fuel convoy in the morning, punch through an enemy blocking position at midday with direct fire, and if the sky darkened, park the same vehicles to form an air defense ring, where armies used to shoehorn specialists into jagged schedules. Send the artillery here, then the AA there, then the transport back. The half-track fleet let commanders synchronize in real time. Logistics tails shrank because fewer unique spares were required. Maintenance crews learned one chassis and its quirks, rather than 3 entirely different platforms. Tactically, battlefield tempo increased. In combined arms doctrine, timing is destiny. Artillery has to arrive now, engineers must follow now, and infantry can't wait while a towed piece is emplaced. A half-track with a 75mm gun could drive forward, fire a short, devastating barrage, limber up, and sprint to the next axis of advance. All without the hours of preparation a towed battery demanded. An anti-tank half-track could dart to a threatened flank, stop and punch, then melt away. Convoys could press forward with integrated air defense that reduced the need for costly fighter cover. In short, firepower became organic to maneuver rather than a separate supporting function. The doctrinal ripple hit training and production too. Truck driver schools expanded to teach gunnery. Artillerymen learned driving. AA crews learned small unit infantry tactics. Factories standardized production runs of chassis while armament and body kits were modular. This was wartime modularity before the term existed. Assemble the base at the plant. Fit the kit at a divisional depot and you had the role you needed. In the field, and in hours rather than weeks. The German response was telling. Early on, they dismissed half-tracks as not real armor, and continued to plan defenses against tanks and trucks separately. But when a half-track battery appeared where it shouldn't, bringing heavy direct fire to a flank, then laying down a curtain of 50 cal anti-aircraft that broke a counterattack, the Reich's tactical assumptions unraveled. Resources were reallocated to guard against threats that had not existed a year before. Reconnaissance had to expand its checklist. Reserve forces were tied up defending newly vulnerable avenues. The strategic consequence was not merely localized victories. Over campaigns in Sicily, Italy, and later Normandy, units with high proportions of multi-role half-tracks closed gaps faster, held ground longer, and provided commanders with options that hardened positions simply could not. The half-track didn't win wars by itself, but by erasing friction, the delay between need and effect. It made entire formations more lethal and more resilient. By 1944, the lesson was clear. Building vast numbers of narrowly specialized vehicles cost time, training, and flexibility. The half-track's genius was pragmatic. A single, robust chassis that could be whatever the fight demanded. In a war where time and adaptability, and not just steel, decided outcomes, that kind of versatility became invaluable. The modern battlefield, with its emphasis on modularity and multi-purpose platforms, was being written on the rusted, tracked beds of half-tracks, long before anyone coined the phrase combined arms integration. Turning mobility into firepower. The birth of the gun carrier doctrine. By late 1943, a quiet revolution was happening inside Allied motor pools, machine shops, and ordnance depots. Half-tracks were no longer being treated as vehicles that could carry guns. They were becoming guns that could move like vehicles. This mental inversion, the moment commanders stopped seeing the half-track as a troop taxi and started seeing it as a weapons platform first, was the birth of the gun carrier doctrine. Up to this point, most armies still treated artillery as something that arrived separately. Heavy guns were towed, positioned, emplaced, registered, and then fired, a process measured in hours. Half-tracks shattered that timeline. Instead of asking, where can we tow artillery to? The question became, where can we drive firepower right now? That change seems small on paper. On the battlefield, it was enormous. The most obvious transformation came in the development of three major weaponized categories. The mobile artillery carrier, direct fire shock units. Mounting a 75mm or 105mm howitzer onto a half-track created a pocket tank, lighter than the Sherman, quicker to deploy, and perfect for smashing bunkers, machine gun nests, and fortified intersections. Infantry suddenly had immediate artillery within eyesight. No waiting for coordinates, no waiting for clearance, no need for a distant fire mission. The gun carrier arrived with the assault. These vehicles gave infantrymen confidence. They meant that when resistance stiffened, support was 30 yards behind them, not 3 miles. The self-propelled anti-tank gun, ambush in motion. German armor had taught the Allies a painful early lesson. If a tank appears and you are not ready right now, you're already dead. The answer, a fast-moving 57mm or 76mm gun welded to a half-track bed. Unlike heavy Allied tanks, locked into linear pushes, half-track anti-tank units could relocate every few minutes. Shoot, scoot, reverse direction, reappear somewhere unexpected. Just as importantly, the gun carrier didn't have to protect itself at all times. It moved with infantry screens, weaving armor and manpower together into a single moving organism. Mobile anti-aircraft platforms, air defense that travels with you. Before half-tracks, AA protection was static, you defended a place. After half-tracks, you defended a column in motion. Quad 50 turret versions didn't just discourage low-flying enemy aircraft. They turned entire convoys into rolling no-fly zones. Even German pilots reported that attacking an American motorized column in 1944 was tantamount to suicide. This wasn't just protection, it was deterrence. When AA becomes mobile and unpredictable, the enemy stops attacking altogether, because risk outweighs reward. The deeper shift, half-track as influence, not equipment, by 1944, the most innovative commanders were no longer using half-tracks to support infantry. They were using them to reshape the tempo of battle. Offensive momentum stopped depending on terrain or weather. If a position had to be assaulted, the half-track made it possible now. If a flank risked collapse, gun-mount half-tracks outran crisis. If air attack threatened a column, anti-aircraft variants made that sky a trap. The decisive factor was speed of effect. Not firepower. Not armor. Effect. In traditional doctrine, obstacles forced pause. In half-track doctrine, firepower rode directly over the pause. The logistics revolution that followed, even more transformative, was what this meant for supply chains. Old, new Model 3 vehicles for 3 rolls, 1 chassis for 3+ rolls. Stationary support on-demand firepower delays built into doctrine speed. Built into doctrine specialized units, interchangeable support. A gun that could move was frightening. A doctrine built around guns that could move was unstoppable. Half-tracks didn't simply mechanize infantry, they mechanized decision-making. They compressed the distance between I need firepower and firepower is here. With every mile, they rumbled forward. They pulled the future of warfare toward mobility, modularity, and improvisation. A battlefield where the winner was not the nation with the heaviest armor, but the army that could react fastest. And in 1944, nothing reacted faster than a gun on tracks. The moment the half-track became a battlefield ecosystem. By the beginning of 1945, the half-track was no longer just a vehicle, and not even merely a weapons platform. It had become the backbone of a flexible combat ecosystem. What had started as a stopgap solution to mud, snow, and bomb-cratered roads evolved into a combat multiplier so influential that it began reshaping how generals planned entire offensives. This is the part of the story most people never realize. The half-track changed the speed of decision-making, not just the speed of movement. From support vehicle, battlefield architecture. If you followed an American armored column from its point of advance, you would see a kind of rhythm to the formation. And that rhythm was being set by the half-tracks. Infantry half-tracks in front, probing and seizing ground. Gun carrier half-tracks close behind, ready to smash resistance before it solidified. Anti-air half-tracks shadowing the column like a moving shield. Command and comms half-tracks keeping the column cohesive. Maintenance and medical half-tracks tucked into the formation like tendons in a muscle. It was no longer artillery somewhere back there. It was artillery in the same space and moment as the infantry they supported. That compressed the decision loop. Leaders didn't have to request firepower. They brought it with them. The psychological shift. Confidence on demand troops who entered combat in 1942 felt like support was a radio call away, and often delayed by terrain, logistics, or confusion. But by 1944 to 45, infantry riding behind or alongside half-tracks developed what veterans later described as offensive certainty. The knowledge that if something popped up in front of them, something equally dangerous was already pointed back at it. Morale is not abstract. It is the belief that firepower will arrive before death does. Half-tracks made that belief real. The German perspective. The Americans don't stop captured Wehrmacht officers later described the most shocking trait of U.S. forces in 1944-45. They never pause to build up strength. They attack immediately from every direction, without waiting, without preparation. That was half-track doctrine at work. Not mass, not superior armor, not mystery weapons, pure momentum. A German anti-tank gun crew might knock out a Sherman. Success, tactically. But before they could reposition, 3 half-tracks reappeared from a tree line. One spraying 50 cal fire, one towing infantry around the flank, one hurling high explosive from a mounted cannon. They weren't fighting a tank. They were fighting a system. A modular force before modular warfare. Existed today, militaries speak of modular combat architecture as if it were a modern Pentagon insight. In truth, it was prototyped in WW2 by welders improvising battlefield Lego pieces built on half-track frames. When one half-track was destroyed, the function it carried wasn't lost. Another could be converted to replace it, sometimes within a single day. No tank could be built that fast. No artillery battery could be repositioned that fast. But half-tracks could regenerate capability. Where tanks defined spearheads, half-tracks defined continuity. The secret of their success. Enough armor, enough firepower, maximum mobility. A tank is a hammer. A truck is a delivery cart. A half-track was something else. Feature-purpose front wheels, speed. Over open ground, rear tracks traction in broken terrain, open top rapid mounting of new weapons, simple frame, endless conversions, medium armor. Just enough to stay in the fight troop capacity, always more muscle behind the gun. The Germans built perfect vehicles. The Americans built adaptable ones. And war, by 1945, was rewarding adaptation more than perfection. The threshold. Before the breakthrough. By the end of the war, these vehicles were no longer seen as improvisations. They were seen as inevitabilities. The obvious answer to a battlefield that would never again be static or patient. Module 10 will explore what this meant not just for WW2, but for everything that came after it. Because once the world saw what a half-track could do, the future of armored warfare would never be the same. The legacy. When improvisation became the blueprint. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, most of the world assumed the armored titans of the war, the Shermans, the Panthers, the Tigers, would be remembered as the vehicles that changed modern combat. And they were remembered. But they were not copied. The half-track was. Its DNA became the template for nearly every major armored doctrine that followed. Post-war militaries looked at the battlefield and realized something the U.S. Army had stumbled into by necessity. Speed is nothing without staying power. and staying power is nothing without flexibility. That's why the very first real heirs to the half-track weren't tanks at all. They were armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, the M113, the BMP series, the Stu-KF-SATs, 251's post-war descendants in France, Czechoslovakia, and Israel. All of them carried one foundational lesson forward. Mobility plus adaptable firepower beats static armor every time. The half-track had proven that a fighting vehicle didn't have to survive every hit, it just had to keep the fight moving. A tank imposed momentum. A half-track generated it. And once generals saw the power of momentum, they never went back. The irony is beautiful. The half-track was never designed to be a hero. It didn't roar onto the battlefield. It didn't dominate propaganda posters. It wasn't a symbol. It was a solution. A rolling Swiss Army knife that let ordinary infantry punch above their weight and bring combined arms to wherever they stood. War had evolved. Tanks made breakthroughs, but half-tracks made those breakthroughs matter.